I grew up a field artilleryman and a fire supporter, and I had a DeVarty commander one time, Colonel Frosty Roberts, who was farewelling our DeVarty SIGO. And at the farewell, he said that the SIGO was the one guy in the outfit he would least want to be, and the one guy in the outfit he would least want to be without. And so that sums up really the discussion that we're going to have here today on the network. I'd like to add my thanks to General Swan and all of AUSA, General Ham and others for hosting this, another great hot topic. As General Swan said, the first panel focused on the readiness of the network itself, with a focus on the joint information environment. This panel switches really to the readiness of the signal, cyber, and intel communities, the forces, soldiers, and civilians that establish, operate, maintain, and defend the network. And so AUSA's done a great job in assembling a very distinguished panel that's ideally suited to discuss the readiness of those communities. So without further ado, let me introduce the panel members. We're going to follow a similar model as the first panel. They'll have about 5 to 7 minutes or so with opening remarks. We're going to go down the line from my right down to the right. And then we want to open it up to discussion, and having talked to all of the panel members, really encourage interaction and discussion, and I think we'll be able to build on some of the things you heard from the earlier panel. So first, to my immediate right, Mr. Gary Wong. Mr. Wong is the Deputy Chief Information Officer, G6 at Headquarters DA, the position he's held since November 2014. His prior senior executive experience is across the joint community, heavily invested in the Navy and at OSD. Following him will be Mr. Jeffrey Rapp, Assistant Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence at G2 Headquarters DA. His senior executive experience is in the Defense Intelligence Agency prior to coming to the G2, where he's been for about 2 years. And that senior executive experience followed a career as an MI officer, culminating at Brigade Command. Following Mr. Rapp, Brigadier General Maria Barrett, who is the Deputy Commanding General for Joint Forces Headquarters Cyber at U.S. Army Cyber Command. Prior to that, she served as the Deputy Commander for Operations of the Cyber National Mission Task Force, and she's had a career serving as a signal officer in Army and joint units around the globe. And then final panel member is Colonel Daryl Brock, an MI officer who is assigned as the Chief of the Information Technology Division at the Army National Guard Headquarters. He holds 2 functional area designations in addition to being an MI officer: Info Systems Management and Information Operations. And just because of the diversity of our Army National Guard force, he's an Italian linguist. So I think we've got a really good, well-rounded panel that can talk about the readiness of the signal, cyber, and military intelligence communities. And so I'll turn it over to Mr. Wong to get us started. Yeah, right here.
This one, there we go. Okay, so, first of all, at the last panel, I was jotting down a lot of notes. I couldn't help but, have to just comment on a few of the questions there. So I'll try to be brief on some of those really quick. I just thought it was important just so give a different perspective, and then I'll talk a little bit about the bullets up here, and maybe you guys can look at the bullets and think about, the idea is hopefully we can get into more of a conversation, and I threw those bullets up there to talk about. So number one, there was a question about autonomy on the network, and we didn't go far enough, but really the idea is to put autonomous agents on the network. And some of the things that can be done autonomously are things like pushing down policy, patching, being able to look at maybe bandwidth allocation, but all those kinds of things can be autonomously performed on the network, and there are instances of that. To me, it's a little bit as, hey, is the culture willing to kind of let go and let some of the artificial intelligence and machine learning kind of things take root and take care of the network caretaker status kinds of things. There's another question about eyesight and why didn't we just like hop on that bandwagon. A lot of people have to understand that when Clapper put in the eyesight mechanism, it was about equitable distribution of IT wealth amongst the IC, and the IC is much smaller compared to JIE. So one, there's a size difference, and two, it was really geared toward JWICs. But where the relationship is really when we want to move from high side to low side, and what are kind of the mechanisms in place, mainly cross-domain solutions over there. And I would say down the road that all three of the services will have the ability to adopt the CLINs that are available to buy from. So, you know, we should be seeing where the G2, the N2, and the Air Force 2 side of the house where they can buy, you know, services off that. So, I mean, to me, that's in place. The other one I wanted to mention about is somebody talked about joint warfighter apps. Oftentimes, apps aren't born joint, you know, from the very start. Oftentimes, there's a lead service, and the lead service, you know, is able to collaboratively either entice or make a strong business case for why, through economies of scale, that application can be a joint application. So to me, I really think about, you know, are we using the same app as opposed to necessarily building joint warfighter apps? And they gave a good example of how we're all moving on Win 10 smartly over here together, hopefully lock, stock, in step. And then the other one is interoperability on the Ben Hodges one. To me, it's really about cross-domain solutions and how we move between coalition and the joint forces over there, and having cross-domain solutions that right now they're pretty high on the overhead. The throughput is pretty low. The bureaucracy to get them in place. And then the idea, as General Farrell mentioned, pretty much the movement to a software solution only. A lot of the cross-domain solutions are very hardware dependent or tied to the hardware piece, and so the idea is to get up above the hardware piece and make it, you know, a software-only solution. So I thought some of those questions are really good questions, and you could spend a long time about that. So just getting to my chart here. You know, I put a chart up on the right side. Really, you know, the y-axis could be anything in the let's say the network world or the intelligence world, whether it's intelligence collection or whether it's bandwidth demand. This one is just devices only, and so you can kind of see where the growth of the devices are. But if you go and Google just bandwidth. Like right now, the thing that's sucking up most of the bandwidth is probably video on the network. So you could look at that huge kind of growth kind of thing. So that it gives you an idea of what we're dealing with and how the three communities who are working together have what they have to look forward. So the first bullet is about speed of change. So often we talk about, you know, changing emerging threat. Well, really, it's the speed of the change. So when you do F double prime, that's really acceleration. So it's a much more complex kind of issue that's going on. And what it does is it compresses the time that you have for the decision cycle. So it's a very, very challenging kind of area to think about. The other thing about the second bullet for me is, you know, as a civilian, I've kind of watched the communities and the services, both from at the OSD level and then also from the Navy and Army perspective. And the challenge is how do we how in the civilian and in the uniform side are we going to move around within the communities without, let's say, penalizing the career? And then how do you incentivize people to move around within those communities? And so and the other wrinkle that's happening now also is how the newer generation coming up is not wedded to an organization for 20 years. They will say, hey, I want to come in and perform service for 5 years to my country, so I'm going to join the military. In some cases, they can't join the military, and they're like, hey, I'll go work for government, and then I'll drop out, and then I'll come back. So the important part also is how do you provide a good onboarding and offboarding experience so that they're up and running really fast. And one of my first exposures to up and running really fast is really the Walmart greeter and the Disney Cruise Line. Those guys get signed up to probably 2-year contracts, sometimes 6 month contracts, but they get them up and running and productive very, very quickly. And so the idea is how do we adopt some of those practices? And so when you move around in the community, are you up and running really fast? And then when you offboard, are you getting ready when you go into another? But the idea is to move around in the communities. To me, personally, just in my own humble opinion, I just think the 2 and the 6 side is going to have to nurture that Cyber 17 community for many, many years, and then after so many years, they'll be able to, kind of build that leadership from within. It might happen a lot faster, but I think there's what is the commitment of how folks from the 2 and the 6 side move in and out of that cyber community and make those contributions. You heard a little bit on the question of on the last panel, really about how we buy stuff and how we procure stuff. We have made some progress when we talk about buying as a service. So we're not necessarily trying to buy the product, stand up the product, and own it and run it. Doing as a service has helped us move in that direction. Treating IT as a consumable and not having the 10 and 15-year life cycle on it. I mean, if it's about $5,000 or less, it's a consumable. It is not worth more. Buying warranties up front has helped a little bit. And so we say, hey, look, it's a consumable. We'll buy a warranty or maintenance up to 5 years. And then afterwards, that thing is like probably, pennies on the dollar. It's costing us just to get rid of it. So those are the kinds of, things that we're kind of looking at and trying to, maybe be a little bit more efficient. You'll always still have to have DoD 5000 to build ships and planes and tanks and things like that. But there is, how do we work within the system to tailor and be much more speed to market in terms of introducing the capability into the for the warfighter in the field. I put this 4th bullet on there just to remind everybody. We like to think of like, okay, hey, the networks and cyberspace is a domain and everything. But, I just don't want everybody to forget, we always, in the early days, in the mid-90s, when we talked about this, is, hey, we really want to weaponize the network. It is, the uniqueness of it is 1 second you're looking up your pay stub, or you're putting money in the bank, or you're making sure that you can take care of some logistics stuff, but in the next second at that same time, that thing also can be used as a weapon. And the idea is to think of the network as a weapon on the non-kinetic side, so you offset casualty and cost on the kinetic side. And then when you're in phase 0, 1, 2, 3 operations, can we use the network as a weapon also to de-escalate? We always think of, this kind of phase 0, 1, 2, 3, can get to kinetic and, go drop ordnance on some geolocation site. But the idea is, hey, can we use the network as a weapon to also de-escalate in there in the non-kinetic side? And then the last one, I really liked Major General Nakasone's keynote. He really hit hard the competition for talent. So I put competition, I didn't say competition in there, but it's really about a competition for talent. And the thing is, we even compete amongst ourselves. When I hear some of these incentives going on, they're out of whack. I mean, they're not even consistent. So if we don't want to eat our young and we don't want to be competing amongst ourselves, we got to think about, okay, how do we want to do that? The other thing I would say about competing for talent is it's not necessarily at the college level, okay? It's at like 9, 10, 11, 12 years of age. I mean, it's kind of scary, but I have friends now. They don't say, hey, my son or daughter's doing this. They say, hey, my grandson and my granddaughter, they're coding in Java, or they're coding in, Python and stuff. So the idea is how do you get to that age group, build up a relationship, so then after 10 years, they go, hey, I think I really want to do service to my country. I'm going to go spend 5 years in the Army, Air Force, and Navy. But that's a long-term relationship that you have to work on starting at middle school. We talk about STEM and attracting, women into the, STEM side of the house. If you're not there before middle school, your chances for attracting women into the STEM world reduces dramatically. I think the same thing is for for this cyber domain here. We have to compete down at that level, and it's no different than sports. I was living in Texas. They go and hit the parent up and at middle school, hey, your kid has a good career, as an offensive lineman, feed them beef and corn, and then they're going to be really good. Okay, the thing is that's what you have to do with if we're going to go compete for talent, because right now we're like number 3 or 4 on the list. Okay, number 1 when a kid comes out of college, it's Google or Yahoo. Okay, number 2 is consumer products, Kimberly-Clark, Procter & Gamble, all those things. Number 3 is maybe DoD contractors. Number 4 is government labs and government. So we're pretty low down on the list in terms of competing for talent. And how we compete is not monetary. It's mission, being married to the mission, doing something for your country. That's probably the best one. And then the second one attraction is the idea of service in the community, volunteering. So we get them like, hey, you can spend time volunteering for a school and teach robotics. You can kind of go work on community service and serving country in a mission that you normally don't get that. But those are probably the 2 big selling points in recruiting folks into government service for this field. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks. Your little anecdote about grandsons and granddaughters could be an indicator that technology is being pushed down to a younger age. Could also be an acknowledgement that you're getting older.
Yes. Right.
Yeah, or both. I'd like to now ask Mr. Jeff Rapp, who's going to talk from the standpoint of the G2 of the Army.
Thanks, General Farmica. I'd like to give a little context, and then I'll talk some specifics about kind of what we're doing in the MI arena. The Chief likes to emphasize readiness is the Army's #1 priority, and there are no other number 1. So everything we do, we have to think about in that context. We've got to be able to win in this increasingly dangerous national security environment where Russia annexed Crimea, they've invaded Ukraine, they're intervening in Syria. North Korea tested nuclear weapons. China is illegally expanding in the South China Sea, and there was recently a ruling that went very bad for them in that regard. Taliban continues offensive operations in Afghanistan, and ISIS continues to metastasize globally. So we've got to do all that in spite of funding cuts that have reduced the Army to its lowest manning levels since World War II, decreased the number of brigade combat teams by approximately 1/3 in the active force, and cut modernization projects to such an extent that will potentially retain tanks for 50 to 70 years. All of this increases the risk to the joint force and ultimately to national security. Since 2011, the Army's modernization program has shrunk by about 1/3. Today, our modernization program, the Army's, is about $36 billion less than the next closest service. The Army risks being outgunned in future conflicts with peer and near-peer competitors. The primary advantage the U.S. Army has over any land force on the planet is its ability to see the battlefield through our information collection and processing capabilities, to create situational awareness by fusing enemy and friendly data into our mission command systems, and to deliver intelligence through our communications networks. This capability provides American commanders an undisputed and decisive advantage over any adversary on any battlefield. And I think we've got to preserve this at all costs. It needs to be a major priority. To improve our intelligence collection, processing, and fusion capabilities, we've developed or are developing capabilities in a number of areas. First is the Distributed Common Ground System Army, or DCGS-A. We're focused on making DCGS at brigade and below simpler, easier to use, and more expeditionary. The result will be a system that's better designed to operate in austere, degraded, intermittent, and limited communication environments. More specifically, the Army is right now training and fielding DCGS-A Increment 1, Release 2. This evolution addresses soldier ease of use concerns, extends capabilities to their top secret networks, provides improved advanced analytics, enhances cybersecurity, and increases the system reliability. Simultaneously, we're working with PEO C3T on initiatives to reduce the physical footprint of the platform at echelons brigade and below by supporting the command post computing environment tactical server infrastructure, or by completely removing servers by leveraging laptops as servers and leveraging tablets as user interfaces. As we look to 2030, we're conducting a holistic assessment of our intelligence, security, and reconnaissance strategy. Our aerial ISR strategy remains on track, and we're now focusing on modernizing legacy ground signals intelligence systems and developing a capability that will converge SIGINT, cyber, electronic warfare, human intelligence, and counterintelligence into one common terrestrial system of systems within the Brigade Combat Team MI Company and at Corps level expeditionary military intelligence brigades. We're also exploring approaches and developing technologies that reduce the burden imposed on our analytic force by the availability of vast amounts of sensor data, especially in forward deployed locations. Fort Gordon is the home of the Army Global Processing, Exploitation, and Dissemination, or PED Center, sits at the heart of this effort. We intend to expand upon the successful evolution of the PED Center, developing a mission command architecture able to support diverse mission sets, from projecting expeditionary PED capacity into underdeveloped theaters to minimizing forward presence by providing reach-back capabilities to Army SOF, the Joint Forces, and Allied PED centers. In the purely communications realm, we're moving toward network, or more accurately, transport convergence. Army MI is working with our Signal Corps brothers and sisters to move transport responsibilities to the Signal Corps and fully leverage Army communications capabilities. For example, we'll move from the Trojan communications platform to WIN-T in order to benefit from its connection to the joint information environment. We do so very mindful of the challenges this may pose and the need to retain our access to the data and services resident in the Intelligence Community Information Technology Environment, or ISITE, which we've mentioned previously. In summary, we're taking a number of steps to streamline and modernize the way we collect, process, and share intelligence in the face of both fiscal and adversarial challenges, with the goal of retaining that edge that we're providing to commanders today, that secret sauce of being able to gain and maintain situation awareness and act on that information pretty much faster than anybody else.
Okay, thank you. General Barrett.
Good morning. So it's really good to be part of this panel and with these distinguished gentlemen on my left and right, and in particular, Daryl, I think it's great you speak Italian. I do not, but I have Italian heritage, so I may speak with my hands. I will try not to hit you today. So I'll talk a little bit about the Cyber Mission Force. I haven't been able to hold down a job, so I worked for General Nakasone for about 8 months, and then I got tasked to help stand up JTF Ares. JTF at US Cybercom focused on delivering cyber effects for those forces in the counter-ISIL fight. And after 30 days, I transitioned finally to my JFHQ-C position. So all of those will combine to frame the readiness discussion for cyber. So now the Cyber Mission Force build, the CMF build, is for US Cybercom is more than halfway through its build phase. So 133 teams, 6,200 personnel. Of that, the Army's contribution, as you heard this morning, is 41 teams. As of last month, 22 of those were FOC, 16 IOC, and 3 in pre-IOC. So I think the Army is definitely on track to meet the FOC criteria of having all their teams built by the end of FY18. One of the unique things about these teams, though, is they start to get employed as soon as they get through their pipeline training. So they start their individual qualification requirements, but we put them on mission, and it doesn't matter whether they're an offensive or a defensive team. And that really is key to them developing their tactics, techniques, and procedures. But as we take a look at, so that's the FOC discussion, and FOC is not the same as readiness. There are two thoughts that I had as we go through this today, and that is the first. The measures for achieving full operational capability do not equate to operational readiness in this domain. There's quite a lot more that goes into that. If you think about FOC, how many people got foundational training, and you heard General Nakasone talk about that. There's other training that probably is required. There's the equipping aspects of this. There is organizational aspects of this. And then second, technology and threats evolve in this domain unlike any other domain. And this condition will require us to continually adjust how we think about readiness and how we execute our mission across the .MLPF. So, having arrived just at Joint Force Headquarters, Cyber, and taking a look at the teams that are OPCON to me, most of them are Army, but I do have some Navy and Air Force teams as well. I'm beginning to think about the teams, and this will resonate for the Army folks in the audience. There are pacing items on that team if you think about the people. If we frame readiness in that respect, if I've got 12 or 14 interactive ions, interactive network operators on the team, or an ion, my readiness is affected not at 11 or 10, and it may be a number, and it also might be a proficiency or an experience level. And we take that for granted from the formations that we've come from, whether it's an infantry formation or an intelligence formation or a signal formation, that we always had those senior NCOs and warrant officers and the motor sergeant that were the subject matter experts in those functional areas that brought up the second lieutenant and the private that were coming out of AIT and OBC. And so I'm beginning to think of my teams, and that's not outlined anywhere in terms of that, because we need to have the ability to train ourselves. And I think framing our team readiness in that respect will be an important for us moving forward and maintaining a certain level of readiness. So that's the individual, there's an individual training piece to that. That very quickly gets into the collective training piece. The exercises that we participate in are essential in that collective training piece as well. They have to be realistic, and they have to be realistic at all echelons. So the strategic, operational, and tactical. These exercises do occur, but they're improving each time we go through them, and we need to really knit them together a little bit better to really refine our doctrine in this space. To that end, I will say having an environment in which you can exercise in, an environment which you can innovate in, is absolutely essential. So a lot of work has been done at US Cybercom and with our Cyber, who is the executive agent for the persistent training environment. I don't think any network owner in this audience really wants us to innovate and try things or do mission rehearsals on your production network. I'll just take a wild assumption that that is true. I got questioned yesterday on another panel, and asked about, can the young team members who are a great source of innovation, do we allow them to innovate? And having an environment like this will really be very critical. The other thing that I think we need to think about is we really need to make sure that when we say full spectrum cyber operations, that is reflected in how we do everything from training to execution. So I've really had the joy of seeing this executed with the Cyber National Mission Force, where General Nakasone has the luxury of having CPTs the protection teams, the support teams, and the mission teams, all under his command, all under his OPCOM. And there is a cycle, a very, very healthy cycle of offense feeding defense and defense feeding offense. And so in order to do that at the service level or with the support to the combatant commands, it's not manifested in the same way that it is in the CNMF. There are some things that organizationally you have to work around in order to get to that. But the intent is pure, and that is a very productive synergy if you allow it to occur. But it won't happen naturally the way we have our organizations. A lot of what I'm talking about too is very focused on the tactical teams, you know, because that's where the build has been. It has been at the tactical echelon. And so we want to make sure that we also don't miss that operational layer. So, you know, it is very difficult, and we were talking about this on the break, it is very difficult for a team in support of a combatant command, and that team might be led by an 04 and 05, to take a combatant command op plan and look at one of those annexes and take that very high level strategic objective and translate that into a, you know, they are working tactical effects. And so this operational layer of planning, it is maturing, but it is now the next area that I would put some emphasis on in order to really accelerate our ability to support the warfighter with cyber effects. And then lastly, I wouldn't, you know, if I think about cyber readiness, there is this, you know, I have talked about this in a very insular way within my own formations, within my own control. But outside of that, there needs to be a development of expertise in combining these non-kinetic fires, all of them. So information operations, electronic warfare, even space, right? And integrating and synchronizing that with a scheme of maneuver. And so I would say that JTF Ares is and some of the combatant commands involved in the AOH are developing that muscle memory of doing this, and that's a good thing. We need to think about the readiness, which we've all talked about here, is the readiness of the network as well, which is a key part of this. How about readiness of the acquisition system, which is an entirely different panel, which I won't touch on, in order to respond to the threats that we're facing in a timely manner. And then lastly, there is the partnerships. General Nakasone talked about the partnerships of DHS and FBI in this sphere. I would say there are partnerships in academia, partnerships in industry, and I think that's a component of our readiness as well. And so with that, hopefully I didn't pantomime with my hands too much.
I'm safe. I'm good.
All right. Go forth.
Thank you. Colonel Brock.
Good morning. Thank you, General Formica, esteemed members of the panel, distinguished guests. It's really good to see some both familiar faces and some great friends out in the audience. I am Colonel Darrell Brock, the IT Operations Chief for the Army National Guard. I'm honored to be here today to provide a perspective from the National Guard on the challenging issues of readiness across the signal, the intelligence, and the cyber communities. And really it's to focus on the question, what are the implications of access in terms of access, personnel, equipment, and training readiness, given the amount of signal, cyber, and intelligence structure within the Army National Guard. So readiness is affecting all of us. It is a significant challenge, but together I think we can take advantage of not only our strengths, but we can minimize the weaknesses both in resourcing, quality, talent, retaining folks to meet those missions simultaneously. So I want to highlight a few things today. From General Kadavy's direction to both the National Guard as a whole. And the first one is warfighting capable and governor responsive. The second is shared vision, one Army, one focus. and lastly, new readiness initiatives to achieve those objectives. But before we get too far along, I want to just use a couple of terms that you probably may be familiar with or may not. The first one is 54. There are 50 states, most of you recognize that, but there are also 3 territories, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, and then Washington, D.C. makes 54. So the National Guard exists in all 54 states, territories, and the District of Columbia. The next term is 1032. Of course, 10 refers to Title 10 U.S. Code. Title 32 refers to, 32 refers to Title 32 U.S. Code. Each of those have their own roles and responsibilities. Title 10 is federal, and Title 32 is state. So first, if we talk about the warfighting capable, governor responsive, it's important to understand that the National Guard operates domestically 24/7. Yesterday, for example, there were 5,082 guardsmen on duty providing support to the United States. From flood support in West Virginia to the wildfires in Colorado, to the water contamination support in Michigan, to actually the RNC support in 4 states are providing resources for that. The intel, the cyber, and the signal communities all participate and provide on-the-job training in response and all the coordination across the board for those events. So one of the things is the schoolhouse readiness, but there's also that no kidding, on the ground, functioning perspective that the National Guard brings to the table every day. But as the Director of the Army National Guard continuously points out, we are the combat reserve of the Army. We are to focus on building readiness for combat in order to support the nation's needs. At the end of the day, all Army National Guard missions require the combined resources of the signal community, the cyber community, and the intelligence communities to operate. They are combat multipliers. We cannot have command and control and cannot function without them. So with those challenges, we support not only the governors for domestic operations, but the warfighting operations in support of the nation. The second is the shared vision of one Army, one focus. In order to meet those challenges, it is vital that we maintain that shared vision and focus on one Army, and one Army that meets all the needs of this nation. Building and sustaining combat readiness requires investment in change, and to that end, everything we do contributes to providing readiness and ready forces for unified land operations. The signal, cyber, and intelligence communities are combat multipliers and also require that investment in change. This isn't about doing business as usual or the way we've done it before. We have to be innovative, we have to be creative, we have to look for new ways of taking advantage of the strengths that the Army provides, the reserves provide, and the Guard provides, and minimizing those weaknesses. Sharing across the board that burden definitely gives us an advantage. It does demand innovation, creativity, and teamwork. And then lastly is the new readiness initiatives. The Army National Guard is examining the need to expand its training days, increase its collective unit training rotations such as combat training centers, and also building associated unit relationships between the National Guard and the active components. If we are to build and maintain, then our normal 39 days may not be enough. And I can honestly say most folks above the grade of E4 in the National Guard get paid for 39 days of drill a year, but they function and perform those duties far more than that. So to the answer to the question we posed a few minutes ago, which is what are those implications in terms of access and personnel, equipment and training readiness given the structure of the Army National Guard, the Army National Guard provides a flexible option in terms of availability, trained personnel, ready equipment to meet the needs of the nation. We are always ready and always there. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Brock. We've got a few questions that are already started coming in. As we're getting to those, I'd like to start with a question for the panel. One of my refrains is that this United States Army is too small to do all of the missions that our nation continues to ask it to do. And so I would ask the panel members, from your perspective, how does a shortfall in Army end strength and force structure directly affect the readiness of the signal, cyber, and military intelligence communities at the strategic or at the unit level? I'd open that up to the panel. I'm not going to let you off the hook, so I'll start calling on you if you don't jump in.
All right, I'll go first.
All right, thanks. I think it's an
that-
important discussion that we need to have as an Army because almost all of the problems we have go back to we're not big enough and we're not resourced enough to do the things we've been asked to do, and I think it has direct implications here.
Yeah, so it's a little ironic for me to talk about shortfalls when we're in the build stage. I mean, I'll just put that out front because you're probably already thinking about it anyway. So right now, directly from a cyber force aspect, it's not felt right now. However, if we're thinking about, I got this wonderful question when I was in the CNMF. We did a town hall with our teams, and a very well-meaning 04 who had been on the team that did some of the assessment for the Joint Staff Intrusion, stood up in the crowd, and she said, I've got a question. She said, why can't the CNDSPs and the network service providers just do their job and patch everything? And General Nakasone looked at me and said, Maria, I'll let you take that one. And so I think that question and the person was from a CPT. I think that question really reflects how difficult it is, how strained those forces and the threat has evolved, the demands to securing the network, the complexity in securing the network has evolved, and the difficulty in actually keeping pace is reflected in her comment. Why don't they just do their job? And the fact of the matter is, it's really hard to do. And so I think that's how it affects the cyber force. In terms of their role in protecting our networks. What is the availability of, because it's all part of a team at some point, whether we're responding to an intrusion on a network, whether we're doing a deliberate engagement, or whether we're off doing offensive. I think there are lots of enablers that are involved in us doing that. We cherish our targeteers. We cherish our intel analysts. And so if they're not there to support us, we're going to have a hard time.
Thank you. Mr. Rapp?
Tough question. I think what I'd first say is we are undergoing a bottom-up review of the MI force right now. So we're taking that on in two phases, kind of looking at one set of questions that we're going to try to have answered by the end of this fiscal year, and then another year to kind of look at what are the ramifications of some of the sizing of the force with respect to the MI force. So it's really kind of starting to boil down to where do we make some trade-offs. So you've got the tactical side, you've got this all the way up to the strategic end, and we're having to take a very hard look at what goes on at each echelon and how can we make activities at each echelon more efficient in terms of what they produce. We've already seen analytic capability go down at some of the tactical levels, and we're trying to avoid any further eroding of that, so we're having to look at the operational and strategic level to make some trade-offs there. We're doing some things, it is forcing us to do some things that probably were a little overdue. If you look at the PED concepts and the way we're operating with PED now, we've made huge leaps forward in terms of joint interoperability with the Air Force, for example. There are places today at Gordon and elsewhere where we can pass lines of ISR between the Air Force and the Army based on capacity and operations at any given moment. So there's some goodness coming out of this as well. But it is strained, and our aerial ISR force in particular has been strained over the last decade plus with deployments and things of that nature. So it is tough. We're undertaking that review, and we're going to have to make some tough choices, I think.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Wong?
So, we tend to, when we speak to efficiencies, they tend to be salami slice efficiencies to get down there. But usually, when you have a huge drawdown, it really boils down to what are we not going to do? And I think that question needs to be brought up more and more. So when Jeff speaks to trade-offs, it might lead to what are some things that we're not going to do. In some cases, there are something. I mean, there's simple things like when Hagel came in with the skimmer stuff a couple of years ago. Skimmer was Strategic Choice Management Review, I think, at the time. But there are some things that we were looking at, like, hey, just reciprocity amongst the services for, let's say, ATOs or IATO kinds of things. I think they're sitting at like 2 or 3 years. Hey, maybe you stretch that out to 5 years. So where are you going to take risks for certain things? And then the idea is, it might come down to, hey, what missions are we not going to perform? And I don't think we've gotten to that hard question in a number of areas. You can't be all things to all people. And you want to really get to what are the core competencies of what the Army's about, and then be able to build bridges and relationships for the companies that you think you need to be close to round out that. So, I was telling somebody, we were out there talking, I said, hey, the best ideas and the collaboration comes out when money and resources start shrinking. So actually, we're going to be, even though you kind of see this downslide in forces and probably money, we should see an uptick in more people coming out of the woodwork wanting to work together, and we should be seeing a little bit more ideas being transformed into reality. And you kind of see it with at the DepSecDef level with DIUX, and I was telling people innovation comes around like once every 10 years. So I've been working 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010. So here's the 4th decade, and the innovation's like springing up again. So you're not going to find a leadership more open to radical ideas more so than I've ever seen over the since the 80s, 90s, or whatever. I mean, you saw a huge downslide on the peace dividend at the end of the 80s, but we're kind of in that right now. But everybody's like afraid to really, pull the trigger and say, okay, we're not going to do this. We've made a decision, and we're not going to do this because we have, and it's not so much that we're not going to do it. It's we're not going to do this because we're going to do something else, and that's really where we got to put down some huge vertical cuts, not salami slice cutting, because we're just fooling ourselves when we do salami slice cuts.
Okay, thanks. This one's from the audience. It's not any easier, and I think it's related because as we get smaller, it's important that the 3 communities become efficient. We see that in the way the panel, or the whole day has been set up with the integration of signal, cyber, and intel communities. So this question is, again, open to all of you. In your experience in the Army, and then Darrell, I'd ask you to add on, and also from an Army National Guard perspective within the Army, are those 3 communities more or less stovepiped than they were in the past? And again, what impacts does that have on readiness? To the panel.
So I'll have to start. I'll jump on that hand grenade.
Go ahead.
Honestly, the last 15 years have brought us closer together than we've ever been in the past. More money has fallen from the sky to resolve issues. We are the best trained, best equipped, best fighting force in history. So coming together, we have worked together. Now we're starting to look at what are those effects of the war is over? What are the effects of those threats are over? How do we start keeping those advantages together? How do we build things together? Whereas before, we could probably go off together, we could do our own thing, but now it's starting to get into, we really need to focus on, hey, what makes the most amount of sense? One of the things on the readiness earlier discussion, there's a lag time. We have a tremendously qualified, tremendously trained force right now. Our linguists and our cyber experts, they take years to build. We won't feel those cuts for a year or 2. If you're a Russian linguist, it's 63 weeks at the Defense Language Institute. So those were already paid for. We've already got those folks in place. Where do they go? Where do they go in the future? So where and when do we build? When do those strategic leaders look together, come together, and solve that problem long term as opposed to the short term? So with the migrations, the network's convergence of the Guard, the Reserve, and the Corps of Engineers, along with the other network owners across the board, the introduction of cyber has really brought, if they haven't been talking before, the signal folks and the intel folks together, because they overlap in so many forms and fashion, it was very difficult to determine who had what left and right boundary. So I think we're in a better position to come together, not only with the resourcing constraints that we've gone on, but we also fully understand that our world has changed, our threats have changed, and we really have to solve those things together. Take advantage of those strengths and minimize the weaknesses across the board.
Thanks. Anybody else?
So, stovepiping. So I'll take my own experience, arrive at the CNMF. There's a process for building the teams. There was all this talk about product phasing for the teams. And so I've got to run down to the J2, quite frankly, and say, Mo, what's product phasing and why do I care? Because I have to give some guidance to the teams in terms of whether or not to steam forward, whether this is a priority, and whether we have the resources to do it. But I think the fact, I'm going to say unequivocally no on the stovepiping. I think it's easy to go there, but even the previous panel brought out, I think Lieutenant General Bender talked about the service culture. In some cases, there are reasons for why that exists. We all operate differently. We all have different infrastructures. We all have different training paths. And so in some cases, it's okay. And we just have to be willing to continually question the assumptions of whether or not it's an appropriate time to partner and do something to join Army and Air Force PED initiatives. And then Admiral Lytle also mentioned that the fact that we're having the C2 debate is a healthy one because we have grown that much together that we have to have it now. How is this going to work? So I don't think it's stovepiped. I think we need to be cognizant of when is it the right time to make the decision. So all these things just really need to grow cognizant of the equities of each other and then make the right decision at the right time when they should become more of a joint endeavor.
Thank you. Anybody else?
So, just taking silo busting or de-stovepiping in general, you'll always go into large organizations and you'll see stovepipes. So just generically, how do you travel horizontally through? So if you had like 2, 6, and cyber as like 3 big stovepipes, so what are some mechanisms that you can use to travel horizontally across those stovepipes or remove what I used to call cylinders of excellence? So there's different planes that you want to think about. So one is on the leadership plane. So across those 3 stovepipes, is the leadership moving around? And I think there is a little bit. I mean, you got, Steve Fogarty's an intel guy. He's down at that training place. Now we're going to have a signal guy, and now he's going to go down there. So the idea is it's leadership moving around, and you're moving them out of their comfort zone in the other communities. And is it going to be accepted? Okay, it's hard to say, hey, wait a second, we used to own that spot. I remember when in the Navy, the J2 was always an intel guy, and they moved Mike Rogers in the J2, and they said, oh my God, and Crippy's got that J2 job, but it shook everybody up. So the idea is to move leadership around out of their comfort zone across those stovepipes. Another plane is really programs of record. Okay, we all like to say, hey, these are my programs of record, and the idea is how do you really push the programs of record across those 3 communities? So, G2 has DCGSA, and maybe on the signal side, we have like programs of record. In cyber, you're seeing them kind of grow programs of record, but how are you mixing up who's running those programs of record across the communities? So, hey, is a signal guy going to be a PM of DCGS? Is an intel guy going to come over and run all our networks? Those kinds of things are going to go on. The other thing is architecture. So that's the technical. We tend to focus too much a little bit on the technical piece, but an architecture is really nothing more than an agreed upon set of standards amongst the community. So we have different forums. We have this data board forum. The SOCI guys pull everybody together with the COE. So in those forums across the community, are we really building stuff to agreed upon standards? So that way we're not, kind of having impedance mismatches later on. And then a couple other ones is really, I always do follow the money drill, okay? The idea is can you collapse the dollars across the communities, and are they executed kind of, I don't want to say jointly, but are they executed in a way where there's agreement amongst the communities on how the stuff is being executed? So, like, maybe when I'm doing all the network stuff, should I be inviting, Annie comes over and I go, hey, Annie, is this going to fit on the IC side? And she'll say, no, that's not right, we're doing this or whatever. But the idea is you got to reach out across the community and say, hey, do we got the right standards? Are we taking care of it? So money's a big one. I mean, really collapsing money, I think, across the communities. But that's one way of de-stovepiping. The other one I would kind of put out there a little bit, something to consider is, I'm kind of a JPub fan, and I'm a big fan of the old JPub 313IO one many years ago, and you had 5 pillars under there. You had CNO, you had SIGINT, you had EW, you had MILDEP, and you had PSYOP in there. And I think Steve's trying to do that a little bit with the SEMA thing and trying to rolling EW in there. But that umbrella framework has been around. So you got JPub 3-12 on cyberspace, and you got 3-13 in there. But the idea is to build this kind of, overlay where all of the different disciplines can be, pulled together. And we might see that in the G39. They're kind of trying to do that there. But you have to do it in the larger context of joint. So in the larger context of joint, what equities are we willing to give up and depend on another service? So I'll give you the example during Gulf War I or one of the things. The Navy was getting ready to go over there, and they said, oh, we're not doing anything in PSYOP. The Army's going to do that. So all the PSYOP stuff came out of the Army. So somewhere down the road, when you're in that kind of joint world and you have the umbrella framework, and I just saw a news thing that the Air Force was going to create an information dominance also. So now you got 2 out of the 3. You got information dominance in the Navy. You'll probably have an information dominance but you got to pick a neutral word, because right now, everything you want to stick cyber on everything, and I think you're diluting it a little bit. But you want to pick a neutral word where all the different disciplines fit all together under that neutral word. So I think you'll see the same thing on Air Force if they're going to. I was reading the article about information dominance there, because it's fairly generic, and you can kind of sweep a lot of the other things in there. So EW, MILDEP, PSYOP, SIGINT, all those things can be kind of pulled together. And then lastly, I would say, is General Barrett alluded to it, is in the O-plan phase. You got to look at. I'm kind of, because of Navy, a 50-77, 50-27 kind of person, but you got to look down in that O-plan and where does each community see themselves in that mission thread, and then is it documented down there? So we often talk about, oh yeah, we're going to put it in the O-plan, but when you actually flip there, there's not a whole lot there, and then the poor 04 who's working the thing has got to kind of fill it in. But the discipline of how that mission thread is leaning on each of the communities to have a piece of the pie or a piece of that mission thread, I think is really important. But those are things that you have to think about doing in terms of, can we do more with less, and then can we integrate across the, communities?
Okay, thanks. This next question comes from the audience. It focuses on equipment readiness to some degree. And I think it may step a little bit into the next panel on acquisition and IT readiness, but I'm going to ask it because it was directed for this panel. It says the Army has recently awarded several important, and it says IT, so this is addressed to Mr. Wong, but I would submit that it could go to any of you if you subtract out the word IT. The Army has recently awarded several important IT-related contracts that were based on LPTA. What are your observations in terms of the performance of these contracts? Is this a trend that industry can expect to continue in the Army? And then I would add, based on your observations, what impact does that have on the readiness of the force? Started to you.
All right, okay.
Because it started at IT,
okay.
so,
Right. So
but I broadened it so you weren't the only guy on the hook.
So last year I went down to TechNet in Georgia, and that question came up. I will tell you, LPTA has a place to be used, but it has been grossly overused in the contracting world, okay? And I said, and I got quoted in that meeting last year, Gary Wong said, you know, LPTA, we need to educate contracting officers on when and when not to use LPTA. And I said, hey, if we don't complain to the contracting officers, they're not going to learn, or they're not going to hear us. So every time I get a chance, you know, Melanie Johnson at Rock Island now, and before when I was in USDI, I said, hey, look, you know, we're using LPTA is not the right place for at least some of the. Now, when you're buying commodities and we're buying like 1,000 widgets, hey, LPTA, go have at it. And actually, I take it one step further. I mentioned this at another place, reverse auctions. I got misquoted as reverse options, but it's reverse auctions. But you can get, you know, huge savings on economies of scale in reverse auctions. So when it's you know, low-cost commodity widgets, I think LPTA is great. For other things like services, especially in the cyber world where the emerging threat is changing so much, you cannot apply an LPTA to a services style kind of contract. And so to me, I mean, really it's about upfront. You have to get to the contracting officer very early on and say, hey, look, we're going best value, you know, we're going to incentivize, we're going to, you know, put evaluation factors in there that allows the vendor to kind of inject new ideas, because you want ideas coming in when it's this fast-changing environment. You do not want a drone-like contract where you're just stamping out, you know, widgets. That's what LPTA is meant for. And the professional services, PSC wrote a really nice article on when and when not to use LPTA, and I passed that thing around. And so the more we have both on the government side and the industry side pecking at the contracting officer, you know, Harry Halleck, you know, I anytime I see him, that's one of the topics I bring up with him. Hey, Harry, we really got to look at how we're using LPTA. So that's my little stint on LPTA. The question was LPTA specific, wasn't it?
Yes, and that was a great answer. And not only did you set the conditions for the next panel, you actually set the conditions for the 1 December hot topic, because we need to capture that thought for 1 December.
Okay, now General Williamson's coming on after this.
Yeah,
So don't be telling him that Gary said blah blah
Nah,
blah
you
blah.
did
'Cause
great.
He's just gonna go take me out by the woodshed.
No, actually, you gave it was a great answer, and it's something that people need to talk about and ought to hear. Anybody else want to talk to that?
So the only thing I would chime on to Mr. Wong's comments is not only educating the contracting officers, is that the folks who are actually writing the requirements document and going into the source selection board, they're the guys that they're not contracting officers, right? And so that education piece needs to happen. So when I faced this for the first time when it was first coming out, everybody's going to do LPTA. You know, you ask the contracting officer, what is this thing and how is it different? I want to first understand and then be understood. And I got a PowerPoint briefing. That's not very helpful. So I called a couple people who had already been on the bleeding edge of this and said, what do I need to know about this? And so I think that piece is, you know, the folks, if we're already talking about shrinking staffs and shrinking organizations, their ability to deal with the work to assess this it's not in their wheelhouse. And I think the acquisition community really needs to recognize that, because then when you're stuck, it's more effort at that point. And so I just kind of chime in on to what everything you said. I don't disagree with what Mr. Wong said.
So I just want to retract use of the word educate, okay? Because it comes across too. So provide feedback to the contracting officer, bring awareness to the contracting officer. Okay, those are much, you know,
Too late.
nicer tone words.
Okay, we're going to stay with equipment readiness. This one's directed just to Mr. Rapp, and then we're going to come to you, Daryl, next for a Cyber Force question. Mr. Rapp, what is the Army's official response to the repeated challenges to the viability of D6A Increment 2? Challenges from Congress and a single vendor who claims to have a better solution. He thought he was getting off the whole LPTA discussion. He didn't know I had this one waiting in the wings.
Well, actually, I think that's a better question for General Williamson to handle at the next panel because it is an acquisition question. But so Inc. 2 is out for award right now, I think, and I think my response to the single vendor thing would simply be that, you know, there was an extensive process that the Army conducted as they went through the analysis of the capabilities needed for the system and surveying the capabilities that were out there. And there isn't a single vendor anywhere that can provide the complete set of capabilities that DSIGS provides. It is a system of systems. It's not one capability. It's not simply all source analysis. It is a suite of systems that provides capabilities, multiple capabilities. So that would be my response to the single vendor thing. So far as the process goes, it's ongoing now. I think the award I think is probably going to continue. There has been a challenge that was I think shot down, and now I think there are some additional challenges that are trying to be mounted, but I don't expect they'll be successful because I think the process and leading up to it was done correctly according to the law, completely transparent and open, and I think it's going to move forward.
Okay, thanks. Colonel Brock, this one's directed for you, but I think General Barrett, you may want to perhaps comment as well. This says the National Guard is creating state-level cyber support teams. How would those cyber support teams at the state level be integrated into Army Cyber Mission Title 10?
Right, so we've established 10 CPT cyber protections teams in an M-Day status, and they're to be phased in over 17, 18, and 19. So there'll be 3 of them created in 17, 4 of them in 18, and 3 again in 19. We are still in negotiations and discussions of including not only those M-Day forces, but also the National Guard's Title 10 CPT into the Cyber Mission Force. So we actually have 11 CPTs established within the National Guard. Most of those in the M-Day status are composed of multiple states. Some are singular, but most times they are actually 3 states. Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas, for example, comes to mind as one of those multi-state solutions. And the intent was to identify not only where we had signal assets and resources, but intelligence resources, so that we could continuously provide and build them organically and not have to pilfer from one side to the other. So that's where we stand today. It's still a work in progress. We still have folks in the training pipeline. And as you can imagine, most of our M-Day soldiers have civilian jobs as well. They work at companies such as IBM, Microsoft, Cisco, Scout, you name it, these folks work there. Now, does that provide them with an advantage? Yes, it does, but they also do this because they love what they do, and to give them the outlet or give them the capability or the opportunity also benefits the nation as a whole. So the authorities and the roles and responsibilities are a little more challenging. So our cyber would have access to the Title 10, and they actually work there at Fort Meade and provide support across the board. However, those M-Day soldiers would have to be activated just as if we were going to activate anybody else, an MP unit or an MI unit, and it would have to be very specific. But at the same time, we won't have them fully trained and stood up. The first 3 will be ready in 17.
General Barrett, did you want to comment on that, or are you comfortable?
So I would add on a couple things to that. One, that process of activating and the transition does get exercised in the Cyber Guard, Cyber Flag exercises, because that authorities piece is and the dual hat status, Commander, is something that is not familiar to most active playing in that sphere. The second, I think something really unique is some of the mutual aid agreements that National Guard forces have between states. So if you have an emergency in one state, they can respond. I think that kind of flexibility is really good to know. He already touched on the industry tie, so I won't expand upon that. But I think the other piece is when you think about National Guard and they just have a natural orientation to responding to state emergencies. So if you think about if you're a state governor and state emergencies, whether it's a natural disaster or a cyber disaster, you have a keen awareness of what the critical infrastructure in your state is. Whether or not that expands to a national emergency or not, but there is that muscle memory, if you will, at the state level for thinking about critical infrastructure in that way. And so what we should see coming out of these exercises is how to do, once we get to certain points in the authority pieces, then pairing capabilities, I think, would really be an acceleration in capability as they go through their training.
Okay, this next one, and I think we got about 5 minutes, but so this next one shifts to training readiness, and it's addressed to Mr. Wong, but again, I think it may have implications across the panel, depending on how you assess the question. But it says, why didn't the military establish a joint cybersecurity training effort instead of each service having to do its own individual training system? And I think some of you have talked to the joint training that we're already doing, so I don't know how you want to take that on.
So first you have to kind of look at how each of the services tackled in building the capability for meeting the cyber threat or meeting the cyber mission. And each of the services, I think, took, let's say, variations on a theme. And it would have been nice maybe to say, hey, can we all start out together at the same time? But when you look at the sequence of events, this goes all the way back probably, I would say, to the mid-90s when we were first looking at things like, and at that time it was C&O, and it was C&D, C&A, C&E for computer network defense, computer network attack, computer network exploit. And so, yes, it would have been nice to say, could we have started out with a joint kind of pipeline training? And I don't think it would have been possible at the time, but that's not to say that today, given the maturation of the services and the pipeline training they have, that you will see a slow convergence toward efficiencies in pipeline training. And it's very much like the cyber stuff is very much paralleling the intel side of the house. What's interesting is, you'll see a lot of, they'll all go to like the NSA, CY series, school series, and they'll be side by side there. Or you'll go to NGA and you'll see, so I think that's gonna evolve, and that will happen over time. And I think the idea of gaining efficiencies and collaboration and showing how, because, General Bender was saying, hey, we're all doing the same stuff together at the same time. And, there's a book out called The Wisdom of Crowds, and how, and I think somebody mentioned crowdsourcing earlier. But I think we're going to see that. Now, should we be accelerating that? Probably. But you don't have like huge national organizations. So like NSA pushes, hey, all the services should go to this school up at NSA, or NGA pushes, all the services need to go through this. So I think that might probably come eventually from Cybercom, and then some of the organizations that are under Cybercom to kind of push that type of thing. I mean, eventually we're going to see that, and you'll see where the services tend to like to, do student exchange and share, and they kind of visit each other's schools and stuff like that. So I think that will happen. But is it going to happen soon enough? Is it going to happen fast enough? Are we flexible and agile to adapt? Because we think of pipeline training as this kind of like 6-month, 8-month thing. To be honest with you, in the cyber world, you're talking like probably days and hours when you think about the world that we're in. It's not going to be, hey, send somebody off and come back and do a great thing. It's going to be, hey, this thing just happened today. and then you'll see like all the academic institutions like CERN up in Pittsburgh, everybody will get together, and it'll happen in less than 24 hours. So that kind of joint training that is compressed in that respect. So it remains to be seen.
Thanks. General Barrett, I'll give you 2 seconds to comment if you wish.
So with respect to building the cyber mission forces, what I've seen is actually specific to those teams, strong centralization on the standards piece during this build phase. And then the responsibility for the training transitions to each of the services. So it actually kind of goes in the other direction. I do think that's probably a good thing from the standpoint of if you're going to scale and expand that expertise into your CNDSP forces and into your network folks and your intelligence folks, and give them a flavor for what's important in this environment. You know, you're not going to be able to keep it at a central location, but the standards determination, probably there needs to be some common understanding of how we operate in this domain at some level. So those are my thoughts.
Okay, thanks. We're out of time. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions. I'd like to close with 2 comments. First, I think between their comments and your questions, this panel brought together a perspective on personnel, equipment, training, and leader development, the pillars of readiness as our Army is talking about them, as it goes across the signal, cyber, and intel communities, and in all 3 compos, particularly looking across the big Army and the unique challenges of the Army National Guard. And so I appreciate the panel for your thoughtfulness, for your preparation, and as a retired soldier, very appreciative of your continued service and leadership in our Army in this very critical area. And my closing comment is, most of the day we'll talk about all of the day we'll talk about the network, we'll focus on the technology, and I never want to leave a panel without reminding us that the most critical network capability that the United States of America has are the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and civilians who will establish, operate, maintain, and defend that network, and it is to them that we owe our gratitude. Thank you very much, and thanks to AUSA.